Hi, everybody. My name is Ellen Pensky, and on behalf of PACKETFUSION, I want to welcome you to our series of Lunch and Learns, and it's all about helping you see clearly in 2020. Many of you have attended our past luncheons, and we really appreciate your interest and your support. So today's topic is cybersecurity, and it is sponsored by Trustwave. And Trustwave is actually, for those of you who don't know them, are ranked the #3 managed security services provider in the world. And they're recognized as one of the leading cybersecurity managed security services provider with customers in 96 countries. So they know their stuff. I know a lot of you have been thinking about cybersecurity, especially in today's what we call modern remote workforce organization. So you're thinking about what you want to do with it. And we know, because we've got a large number of you who are interested, we know that you're interested in knowing what you can do for your organization. And you're going to learn a lot about that and share some stories. So it's going to be great. Our presentation will probably be about 45 minutes, a lot of Q&A, so there'll be time for that. So now I want to introduce our two speakers. First up is PACKETFUSION CEO Matt Pingatore. As Matt said, he knows a lot of you on here, and but not everybody. So it's a chance for him to talk to all of you and meet you. And Matt has about 30 plus years experience in the telecom industry. He's acknowledged as an industry leader, and he has a wealth of knowledge and experience about getting to the cloud. Our special guest today is John Cartrett. And John is the director of Trustwave SpiderLabs Americas and the Red Team lead. His responsibilities include managing all of the Red Team services in the Americas, and he's a subject matter on everything Red Team Global. And for those of you who don't know about Red Team, we're going to hear a lot about it today. John may even share his lovely t-shirt that he has there. He has 18 years of information technology experience, 10 years of offensive testing experience, the last 5 years, especially on Red Team. So wealth of knowledge, some really interesting stories. We're really lucky to have you here, John. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt for a couple opening comments, and then we'll go right back to John.
Appreciate it, Ellen. Thanks everybody for coming. As we said earlier, I know about half of you on the call, so you know what we do and where we've come from. The other half, welcome. Traditionally PACKETFUSION has been a unified communications voice over IP specialist. In the last 3, 4, 5 years, we've transformed ourselves into a cloud professional services organization. And part of that is putting, cloud-based phone systems, cloud-based contact centers. But now that all that's happening, you can't ignore the middle part of it, which is the network. So we're very much in the SD-WAN and the secure access, secure edge, which is SASE, which now begs the question for security. So we're knee deep in getting our customers into a more secure method of way of doing things. And there's two fronts of that, right? One is product service related, where you're buying an actual service or a product to do what it's supposed to do to keep the bad guys out. And that's only half the battle. The other half the battle is understanding how to take those boxes and that technology and make it sing and make it work. And really that's where these guys from Trustwave and SpiderLabs come in. And so they don't have a intellectual property where they're selling you their service for a product, but what they're doing is making sure that the threats and the detections and the products that you have work 100 times better. Right. So he talked about Red Team, which I equate this to like the SEAL Team 6. These guys are the badass dudes trying to figure out what's going on out there in the deep dark web, and trying to figure out all the malicious malware and all the things that's happening. Trustwave is the guys that, I think maybe you'll talk about this, John. There was the Golden Spy malware that was on every piece of software that the Bank of China put on servers that allowed them to do their electronic trading, transfer of money. And, hundreds of thousands of servers, this malware was put on by the Chinese government. These guys discovered it. Another one that's right in the news today or in the last week, we all heard of the dark web. It's just the subplot of subterranean web that's hard to get into and nefarious stuff happens. But these guys found, basically hundreds of millions of records of first name, last name, security, social security number, party preference, email address, and basically they were trying to sell it to the highest bidder to disrupt our election. So these fat guys found it, put a stop to it. Really cool. I'll end it with this before I turn it over to John. My favorite things that these guys do, right? They'll help you with some vulnerability testing and penetration testing to let you know that you have problems, remediate the problems. Great. That's, we fixed it. Then they will do a proactive approach on the back end and manage in an MSP type form, managed service provider format, any of the boxes you have. It's not enough for you to go spend hundreds of thousands of dollars and have these Palo Alto firewalls installed and say, check, we're secure, because you have to make sure these Palo Alto firewalls are humming and singing and doing everything they're supposed to be doing. You can be along the security maturity matrix, and you can be, a guy doing denial of service with a box, or you can be all the way up to the right, and talk about a little bit later, where you're actually doing proactive threat detection and basically checking these things off on a monthly, yearly, daily basis to make sure all the bad guys aren't coming in a proactive fashion. So these guys are badass. I love everything they do. Ellen, you said they're number 3. They're number 1 in my book. So John, I'm going to pass it off to you. I'm going to try to add color throughout, throw
Sure.
some calls your way. And guys, hit us in the Q&A so we can get your questions answered in a timely fashion. John, you are up.
Perfect. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Ellen. That was fantastic. So I guess since we're already talking about it from a Trustwave perspective, we do anything and everything that a business could need from a security standpoint. Like Matt was talking about, we do everything from anything in the offensive testing space to actually help you secure your perimeter, secure your internal systems, your applications, all that kind of stuff. Everything from vulnerability assessment all the way up to the most elite stuff, which is red team and even teaching from a purple team perspective. But we also do audits and management of any of the firewall type devices that you potentially have in your environment. We can help you audit and configure Active Directory, all of those kinds of things, as well as help you set up, maintain, monitor. We can even manage any of your incident response, your SOCs, your SIMs, all that kind of stuff, right? As well as we do proactive threat hunts to find bad guys that are already in your environment, all those kinds of things, right? It's basically, Trustwave is almost an A to Z security provider from that perspective, right? So with that, I think Ellen did a fantastic job kind of talking about my background and what it is that I do for Trustwave. I'm specifically in the SpiderLabs division for the Americas, and specifically around all of the offensive testing offerings. But I'll kind of talk about a little bit of everything that Trustwave does, and I think we'll get into some interesting stories here in just a minute. With that, let me just jump in. So here's what the agenda is for today, right? So we've got a couple things that I'm going to talk about. First thing is maybe the top things to consider, when thinking about a mobile workforce and kind of what has changed. We're going to talk about the blurred perimeter lines, right? Historically, we've had this monolithic setup and specific, type of perimeter that we've been dealing with for decades. It's changed. In case nobody's noticed, right? I imagine everybody has, but that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about what the traditional network security stack looks like and what some of the problems are with it, right? Additionally, we'll talk about what the traditional DFIR and threat hunting process looks like, and kind of where the shortfalls are with the current the current setup that companies are facing, right? And all of this kind of hinges around the changes, specifically around the pandemic and the mobile workforce, the mass expansion of the mobile workforce, right? Then we're also going to talk about cloud native solutions and kind of how they're on the rise and what does that mean for security. And then we're going to talk about, I got some cool stories, a few cool stories to share about validating assumptions, security assumptions through red team exercises. With that, we'll jump in. So the top 4 things to kind of start thinking about are, how is your organization? And this is, like we said, specifically about the mobile workforce, right? And kind of how things have changed. But how is your organization validating the secure state of long-term remote devices? Because historically, devices, would at least check into the home office or come into the office every so often or whatever to get updates. A lot of devices, probably in most companies, stayed at the home office for most of the time. So all of the management, monitoring, and all of the security stuff, right, that you typically have, all the auditing stuff, all the inventory stuff that you have, was designed around that, was designed for those assets to be in that physical location, right? And so with things changing, with them not being in that physical location, how is your organization validating the secure state of those long-term remote devices, right? And that includes patches and antivirus and any other security configurations that you have on that, any other software that you have for inventorying. How are you inventorying those applications if they're no longer inside the or those devices if they're no longer inside the corporate network, right? Or at least maybe at the time that those scans are happening. Because historically, scans have happened on a scheduled basis, right? They're not running 365. They run at a very specific time. It's usually at night, whenever there's not a lot of activity going on, and they're not going to exhaust the network traffic. And so if you have a mobile workforce now, those systems aren't going to be hitting those devices, whether that's vulnerability scanning, whether that's asset inventory, or so on and so forth, right? An additional question that we need to be thinking about is, how are you collecting security event logs from those long-term devices, right? Because collecting events and logs is extremely important in detecting malice on those devices, right? And if you do detect something, number one, how are you detecting it once you get those events across this disparate set of devices, right? They're no longer in a single location. And how are you going to respond to that, right? Especially when threats are increasing, right? With the current pandemic and all of the panic and fear that is kind of running around, it's a gold mine from an attacker's perspective. And lastly, but not least, once you have detected that something has happened, how are you going to restore the compromised data or systems from that remote stack, right? Those are all very key important things that historically we have taken for granted in the corporate location, because all of the assets are there and everybody is there and they can huddle in this one location, right? Well, all of that has changed with all of the remote work that's going on, and all of the systems now that have moved out of the corporate space and kind of into the home space, if you will. So really quickly, we'll talk about the rapid expanse of remote work, and these numbers have continued to increase. But so previous to the pandemic, right, there was the Bureau of Labor shows that there was roughly about 7% of employees that work from home, right, or had those options to work from home, which is pretty small, right? It's not even 10%. And then right as the pandemic was hitting the U.S. and was kind of getting into the beginning stages, that rapidly increased, according to a Gallup poll, to roughly about 31%. And then less than a month later, whenever the pandemic was in full swing, it was up to 62%. And this number has continued to increase, and it's probably almost close to 2/3, if not 3/4 of the way up, right? And so basically what that means is that most of the economy is, or most, I guess, honestly, yeah, most of the economy is working remotely, right? So things have changed. Well, what does that mean for organizations, especially moving forward? One of the things that I thought was pretty interesting in researching that is that it almost seems as if business operations have changed forever, right? And I'm not sure that things are going to go back to the way that they were. They may, but I guess only time will tell. There's several surveys that I thought were pretty interesting. The first survey that I read is that it seems people are less interested in going back to the office more so than ever before, right? One study specifically talking about the people in the US is that 47% of workers would prefer to work from home at least 1, if not up to 4 days each week, right? And it seemed like the stats were leaning more towards working from home 3 to 4 days a week versus working just a single day from work, right? And 40% of those want to stay home all the time. So almost half of the employees that have been forced to go home because of the pandemic want to stay home. So what does that mean for your organization? And if you look at the last piece, only 14% of the remote workforce, or the people that are currently working remote, want to come back to the office. So I think that is going to change the way that we think about security, from a device perspective, from an employee perspective. Another survey that was pretty interesting about the current hiring that's going on is 70% of hiring managers are now offering work from home options, right? So that the things are definitely changing, and I'm not sure that they're going to go back, right? this last one that I thought was really interesting. I read an article about how the lines between work and personal life are continuing to blur as people get kind of settled into working from home. There's less this, I'm going to get in the car, I'm going to drive to work, I'm going to go into the building, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to do my work, I'm going to leave, I'm going to go to lunch, I'm going to come back, I'm going to do my work, and then I'm going to leave the office and I'm going to go home. And when I leave the office, I leave work at home. And when I get home, I start doing personal matters, right? Start playing with the family and all those kinds of things. Well, what has started to happen is those lines have started to blur because people aren't working their historical regular hours. They're starting to kind of flex their hours and work whenever they get up and work for a little bit and do some leisure stuff or do personal matters. One of the studies that I read said that 42% of remote workers are tending to personal matters and engaging in leisure activities during historical regular business hours. Well, what does that mean for the organization? Well, if they're using their corporate asset for work stuff, and then they're going to switch over and do personal matters or any kind of leisure stuff, they're going to be probably doing that on company assets. So you're now starting to see an uprise or an uptick in non-company activities happening on company assets, right? And one of the things where that's a really, really big deal is because we're no longer operating under the model of the traditional network security stack. Because at work, when you would do, as an employee, you would do those leisure activities on your computer at work, there was a lot of protections, especially on the network, that were keeping basically keeping your computer safe, right? It was keeping the bad guys on the outside and hopefully blocking the stuff before it made it to your computer as you were browsing the web or reading email or whatever, right? And so one of the things that I thought was super interesting about the Ponemon study from this year is that they said that 71% of respondents to the survey said that the remote work is going to increase the time in which it takes them to identify breaches, right? Which is crazy because the numbers are already at 280 days on average, right? Now, I mean, it totally makes sense because those devices are no longer inside your environment, and any network IDSs and IPSs and web proxies and all those kinds of things that we have historically put inside the organization are no longer influencing those devices, right? And so, as well as if you're doing any types of logging through Windows events and those types of things, if you haven't configured your external systems in a certain way, right, you're potentially not going to see those events that are coming from those computers. You're going to have gaps from that perspective, right, which is going to increase the time before you see malice happening. And most likely, you're going to see the malice once it's already spread into the internal network, right? And if it increases beyond 280 days, I mean, we're getting close to a year from that perspective. And as you'll see in the red team stories that I have later on, there's a lot that an adversary can do in your environment in 280 days. There's a lot that we can do inside an environment in a couple weeks. So I couldn't imagine sitting on an environment for 280 days, if not, longer than that. Talking about the survey again, 70% of the people that responded said that the remote work is going to increase the cost of a data breach, which totally makes sense. I mean, they also said that we're currently at 130,000, on average per incident, right? And if you're talking about any kind of control data, then those costs are going to skyrocket exponentially, right? And so basically what that means is that everybody has gone to, because of the pandemic, everybody has been moved to remote work. They don't really want to come back. And it looks like that process is going to complicate security, and it's going to make things more expensive for us if we don't pay attention to it. And so it's a real issue from that perspective, right? So I want to touch a little bit about, I've alluded to the traditional network security stack, and I just want to kind of, do a level set to make sure everybody understands what I'm getting at, right? So this diagram here in the shows basically how complex that our environments typically are, right? We've got big switching environments, and we've got all of these servers and all of these devices, and we have wireless networks and all these different assets that you have in your environment, right? But in every layer, most organizations are applying some type of security, right, at those particular layers. I mean, at your network layer, whether it's wireless or physical network, you could have NAC solutions or things that kind of control access from that perspective. You most likely have types of web security products, you know, whether it's a WAF that is protecting websites that are exposed to the internet, most likely have a application, you know, application layer firewall that's doing proxy configuration type stuff, or maybe just a web proxy itself that is filtering traffic as it's going out to the internet, trying to keep all of your end users safe. You most likely have an IDS or an IPS device somewhere in line that is watching network traffic to see if there's an anomalous behavior, if there, you know, are things that are going on, you know, from your workstations or coming from your workstations or connecting to servers that shouldn't be, right? So there's tons of you know, security devices that you probably have in place. You probably have a SIM and have all the data coming from all of your assets, you know, that are inside your environment, whether it's syslog or whether it's Windows event forwarding or what. I mean, the list goes on from that perspective. Basically, the gist is, with the traditional security stack, all of this technology and all of this stuff, all of these layers of security have been put in place at one location or on one corporate network, you know, to protect a couple locations, right? But it all stems from the fact that this is coming from or sitting in front of a network that the organization owns and trusts from that perspective, right? And if you look down here on the corner, what you're up against is basically, this is your remote employee's laptop, right? The company asset that has gone home and is on the same network as all of these other devices, you know, whether it's voice over IP phones, whether it's you know, network printers, it is personal devices, it's smart home stuff. I mean, the list goes on and on and on and on. And in the extremely connected world today, there's tons of IoT devices. I would say that most home networks probably now are probably more sophisticated than, you know, a lot of small business networks are currently, right? With all the tech and all of the things that people buy and deal with, right? And where the traditional network security stack, you know, it's kind of its Achilles heel, right? Is it's very much a monolithic design, meaning that these devices are you know, inside of it and are protected because of it, right? They're kind of behind this layer. Well, the only way that this is your remote assets are going to be protected by all of this stuff is if you are enforcing a non-split tunnel VPN all the time, right? So if you give your employees the option to connect to the VPN when they need it, they're probably not going to connect to the VPN unless they need to connect to a specific company resource that's not allowed on the internet. Why? Because when they're doing, you know, random stuff, browsing the web or whatever, they're going to be going through that VPN, which is probably going to slow down their connection. And just because they want faster internet, they're probably not going to connect to the VPN, or they're not going to favor that, right? And most organizations don't enforce VPN. And if they do, it may be from a split tunnel perspective where, you know, you're still going to leverage your home internet to do internet stuff, but, you know, you're going to leverage the corporate network when you need to access corporate resources, which exposes that particular employee to an unprotected view of the web, if you will, because we, as employees, we don't have, or individuals, we don't have, especially enterprise grade web proxies or any of this type of security stuff that corporations typically have, right? And that's where the biggest risk comes from a remote perspective, right? So DFIR and threat hunting is kind of the same way. So historically, you know, any kind of digital forensics or incident response stuff, excuse me, focuses around, you know, number one, using logs and stuff that you collect from assets, you know, in kind of a real-time perspective, usually, like I said, Windows event forwarding or those types of things, and you know, identifying malice and then going and putting physical hands on you know, a device to do some analysis of it, right? And it starts from, as you can see in this image, it starts from an IDS alert or, you know, some kind of alert from a SIM that keys off of a specific event that it sees, whether that's, you know, from the endpoint itself or whether that's from network data, from an IPS, from a web proxy or an application layer firewall, those types of things, right? Or, you know, whether it's a key off of an IP address that came from a threat intelligence feed saying, hey, this particular box is communicating outbound to a known bad IP, right? All of that stuff kind of hinges around the fact that that device is behind all of those types of detection capabilities, all of those log collection sources, right? And so from that perspective, while they're at home, those devices aren't, historically being influenced or being logged or evaluated by these network security devices that we historically have, back at the home office, if you will. And threat hunting is kind of the same way. Threat hunting is very much a so with digital forensics and incident response, right? It's very much a responsive thing. It happens after. It's a very reactive type of process, right? Whereas threat hunting is a very proactive approach to incident response, right? It's where the IR investigator, right, is going to actively poll systems. Now, whether that's through an EDR solution, which is a very lazy way to do it, or whether that's through some other type of agent or access to the systems. A lot of people will do it through VMI or through PowerShell remoting, or through tools like it escapes me at the moment. What OS query, right, is another one, or any other type of system that gives you the ability to query remote systems, right? But it's the act of actually polling those systems to see, what and usually checking them against a known good list to find any binaries that are out of place that maybe a malware or an EDR solution hasn't picked up, or to find files that are out of place, or other IOCs on a particular system, or a particular group of systems that may indicate that it is compromised, right? And so there again, that process of threat hunting is very dependent historically on those systems being on the same network as the threat hunter, right? Especially when you're talking about manually querying those boxes if you're not leveraging something like an EDR, and especially if that EDR is not cloud-based, right? But it's very much a point in time type of engagement where you scan all of those boxes looking for those particular IOCs. But there again, it's going back to that traditional network security stack where everything has to be at the home office, right? And if you have tons of remote workers, it kind of negates a lot of that stuff, right? And the other thing that is different, is that most of the time with computers and stuff, especially as we kind of alluded to earlier, those devices would remain on and were always accessible. And if you were doing any kinds of scans or analysis of this sort and in off hours, you were going to hit those boxes. Now, where that becomes a problem is now you have most of your staff, if not all of your staff, working remote. And as the work-life balance blurs, they're going to start flexing their hours and they're working at random times, which means, number one, they're probably not going to be on at night whenever those scans happen, which means that those assets aren't going to be included in those scans, right? And so people are going to start working from a more sporadic standpoint, and it's going to be harder to hit those devices if you don't have agents on those devices themselves, right? If you're trying to use the old mentality of connecting to remote services APIs or whatever, and pulling data back from that system. And that's where, kind of the cloud native solution is on the rise, right? And that's kind of the answer, is that agents on the system that give you access to that device regardless of where it's at. And we're seeing a huge rise in those types of things where it doesn't matter if the system is at the office, is on the road, is at home. You have the ability to reach out and touch that device. You have the ability to pull information from that device, and you have the ability to detect malice on that particular device, right? And so we're seeing a lot more of that stuff. And it comes with its own challenges, but it also comes with some huge benefits from that perspective. So I guess with that, we'll kind of shift gears a little bit, stop talking about some of the theoretical stuff and start talking about some more technical stuff, right? One of the things that kind of hit me as I was putting this presentation together is a quote that I read once upon a time, and it was, "In the midst of chaos, there is always opportunity," which I think is very fitting for the current days that we are in, right? And so I guess with that, let me kind of jump into or give you a little background on, what Trustwave's answer is for a lot of this stuff, right? How we simplify the headaches. Everybody knows that there is a shortage in InfoSec of professionals who know, how to wield specific tools and have the expertise to architect specific things and so on and so forth, right? One of the neat things about Trustwave is that we do all of that stuff, right? As well as we have this single pane of glass that we call Fusion that all of that stuff feeds into. Everything from my side of the house that is the offensive side of the house, whether it's vulnerability scanning, whether it's testing, red teaming, that's all under this identify block, and it feeds into Fusion and gives additional visibility or additional context to any of the data that's already in Fusion, right? We also have a consulting side of the house that will help you adjust your protections and identify the gaps and all of those kinds of things, and to make sure that you have the appropriate applications and architectures and all those kinds of things to put in place to truly protect the things that you do have, right? As well as we have, we integrate with all of the big providers, and I'll show you a short list here in just a minute, of all the different cloud providers and stuff that we integrate with to actually pull all of that disparate data from all of those different tools that you have into a single pane of glass that you can then get additional context based on any of the testing, vulnerability scanning that you do, right? So it's kind of it's a one-stop shop from that perspective. And it's a really, really neat platform, and something that I'm really, really proud to be a part of. So with that, I'll show you a little bit, kind of a sneak peek on all of the stuff that, and these are a ton of big buzzwords, right? Everybody knows a lot of these things, but specifically when you're talking about the EDRs that we were kind of alluding to earlier, that are cloud-based or cloud-native EDRs, right? This is the way that you can get that asset data, that event log data, that alert data back into a single platform. And whether you have a mixture of these or all of these, whatnot, all of these things can simply report back to and roll back into the Fusion platform, and you can see that in that single pane of glass, right? And as you can tell, there's been a ton of investment in integrating with all of these different security platforms and bringing all this data into that single place, and then on top of that, applying our additional threat intelligence on top of it. And, as Matt alluded to earlier, we have researchers that look for all of that kind of crazy stuff. And recently they found on the dark web, I want to say it was like 187 million records for voters. And it was, some pretty juicy information from that perspective. And they were definitely trying to sell it. Who knows what the intent there, if it was simply money or if it was actually to influence the upcoming election.
Once you find it, how do you shut it down? Or do you notify?
Yeah, you can't really shut it down, especially when you're talking about stuff on the dark web, because once somebody has the data, they have the data. And even if you take down those accounts or you take down that set of data, the data is still there. It will always be there. Somebody's going to have it, and it's going to resurface at another point. You can try your hardest to stop that stuff and whatnot, but ultimately the data is already been lost. So yes, it's all about notifying everybody, and I think everybody is probably aware that this isn't the first huge breach. I mean, there have been many, many breaches. I would imagine that everybody's data in the US has been breached at one point or another, is on the web somewhere. And so taking, personal security matters are important, right? I mean, locking your social security number and making sure that you have credit monitoring and all those types of things, right, are very, very important. It's still important to stay vigilant and to not expose yourself, but at the same time, you also have to take, advantage of those other things to protect yourself, right? Because the data is there, it's already there. All right, so now we're going to talk about some red teaming stuff. So there's been, I kind of alluded to this at the very beginning, there's been an increase ask for red teaming, and specifically one specific type of red teaming that I thought was pretty interesting, and I think kind of fits into the theme of this discussion, right? And so these are an example of some of the questions that I've gotten from customers, and as we kind of begin the red teaming scoping calls. And don't worry, if you're new to red teaming, you don't know what that term means, I'm going to explain exactly what that is and kind of what the difference is between vulnerability scanning and pen testing and all those kinds of things, to make sure that we're all on the same page, right? Because everybody knows that in the InfoSec industry, especially the IT industry, that terms are very muddy, right? Everybody has their own interpretation of what they think a specific term means, and so I'll try to do a level set before we get into the stories. So the questions that I've gotten in recent times are, what happens if one of my remote assets gets infected, right? People aren't asking, well, could my remote asset be infected? No, they're like, I know that it is, at some point it's going to happen, right? It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And so they're asking, what does that mean? right? If they're at home and my asset gets breached or compromised, well, what does that actually mean for my organization? Another one we have is can I detect the misuse of those remote assets? I don't know. I feel like I can, but that's an assumption, right? I feel like I've got good event monitoring, good security logging, and I feel like I'm seeing telemetry from those devices, but could I actually detect something if one of those devices becomes compromised? Another one is, am I doing enough to truly defend my organization? I feel like I am. I feel like we've done a bunch of stuff, but I'm not sure if it's enough, right? And those are all assumptions. And another one that has been pretty interesting in recent times, that we've actually gotten more so now than we have historically is, I'm not sure how well I'll respond to a breach, or, how that process will look. I feel like I have all of the tools I need, but we've never tested it, right? And I think now everybody's very cognizant of, in these strange times, that we have to be prepared from that perspective. And so those are some of the questions that our customers are asking and that we're answering with Red Team engagements. So to kind of do a level set really quickly, right? And I'm going to use picture analogies to help everybody understand what it is, right? So when we talk about vulnerability scanning, right, it's very akin to, from a military perspective, would be like the drone flyovers, right? They're getting a 50,000 foot view and they're zeroing in on targets from that altitude, if you will. It's very broad, it's very comprehensive, and it's all about vulnerability detection, right? And from our perspective, it's also about false positive reduction, through evaluation of those, right? And internal and external stuff is very much baseline hygiene, right? From that perspective, everybody should be doing vulnerability scans, whether that's on the asset itself, whether that's from a network perspective, all those types of things is definitely a baseline, right? Moving up the stack, network pen testing, it's very akin to, if vulnerability scanning is akin to a drone, then network pen testing is akin to a group of Marines walking down, a street in the middle of the day, checking every doorknob, looking at every house, clearing every house to find all of the bad guys that are there and trying to get rid of them, right? So from a pen testing perspective, it's very overt, it's very noisy, but it's comprehensive, right? If I was going to use another analogy, it's it's a mile wide and it's an inch deep, right? Because we're trying to look for all of the vulnerabilities that we can find, and we're trying to press on all of those or validate all of those through exploitation, right? That's ultimately what pen testing is about. Now, red teaming is slightly different. So if pen testing is about being overt and it's a group of Marines, like Matt said earlier, red teaming is very akin to SEAL Team 6, right? It's going to happen in the cover of darkness. We're only looking for a single vulnerability that allows us to breach an organization. We're not looking for all the vulnerabilities. We're not trying to be comprehensive. There again, the same analogy would be an inch wide and a mile deep, because we're only looking for that single vulnerability that allows us to breach an organization to then go after whatever goals are set forth for us. We don't use noisy vulnerability scanning processes, and it's all about testing the preventive and detective the capabilities of an organization. And in red teaming, when I talk about goals, specifically what I like to ask customers is, what are your nightmare scenarios, right? If XYZ happened to your organization, it would be completely catastrophic. Those are the things that we try to make come true, right, from a red team perspective. And so I guess the last one to talk about is purple team, right? If you've heard red team, you probably heard purple team, and it's another color. It's a box of crayons, if you will, right? But for us, purple team is literally where we take our red team operators and we leverage those guys to teach the internal, pen testers or internal defenders how we operate, right? And so there again, the military analogy would be a group of Marines that are teaching a band of Iraqi soldiers how to be good soldiers, right? From that perspective. And that's literally what to us purple team means. It's very much a teaching engagement, but it's done with the same guys that would execute red teams. Excuse me. All right, so now story time. So I'm gonna brush through this really quickly because we're getting close to time, and so I'm gonna leave out a lot of detail, but I'll try to give you as much as I can. So this is an assumed breach red team, and what assumed breach means is that instead of the full scope engagement where we go through the social engineering, the OSINT, which is the open source intelligence stuff, the dark web analysis, yada yada, right, phishing, all that stuff to realize or breach ourselves, the customer seeds us with that access, and we go from that point, right? It not only saves on budget, but it also allows you to test specific assumptions. In this particular case, this was a customer who was interested in, what if one of my remote assets got breached? And that's what we simulated. So we sent them a Trojan binary, and they detonated it on a remote workstation that was outside of the organization, right? And currently was not connected to VPN. So that simulates a user at home browsing the internet, their box gets popped. What happens? What happens next, right? So what basically happened is we had complete control of that particular system. We started key logging that system, and we're able to grab passwords out of memory as they were typed and from disk, right? So we had a ton of passwords from that perspective. Started doing analysis or recon on the system, and we found that it had some OTP software, otherwise known as 2FA type software, MFA software, RSA tokens, those types of things, whatever you want to call it, right? It had configuration files, seed files that were basically how the device was configured. So we were able to clone that software and take that software offline, as well as to marry that with the passwords that we had captured off that device. And basically what that means is that we were on a device that had security technology on it. We were able to capture passwords, and we were able to clone the MFA software. So we now had valid credentials and a valid second factor authentication token, which allowed us to directly connect to a Cisco VPN solution and connect to it as a trusted employee. From that point, we had access to the internal network as that employee did. We did our reconnaissance, evaluated the internal environment, found some vulnerabilities that ultimately allowed us to compromise Active Directory. And what I mean by that is that we were able to gain the same level of administration permissions to Active Directory domain controllers as the internal IT staff, which then allowed us to pull out all of the usernames and passwords for every user in the entire environment. And where this got really interesting is that this particular organization that we were dealing with was a subsidiary, a relatively large subsidiary of a parent organization. And once we compromised the Active Directory, we simply remoted into, well, I guess let me take a step back. We started doing analysis on all of the information that was in Active Directory, and we found that there was a trust between the subsidiary location and the parent location, right? So long story short, we got onto the domain controller and the subsidiary, and we were able to find a flaw in that trust, and we were able to take advantage of that trust and ultimately compromise the Active Directory environment inside the parent organization, which then ultimately allowed us to remote into a server in that parent organization, which allowed us to automatically register a brand new token because that user had never used a token, which then allowed us to directly connect to VPN to the parent organization, right? And so from that perspective, we were inside both organizations and had complete control of both environments from a single employee's laptop that wasn't connected to VPN at the time because of the data on that laptop that we were able to pull off. So all it takes is one computer to get breached at one time. And by the way, all of this stuff happened within a couple weeks, not within 280 days. And so being on this environment for 280 days, we could totally destroy this environment. We could totally replicate this environment. We could be competitors to this organization. I mean, whatever. We could hold their entire environment hostage if that's what we wanted to, right? Realize we're getting short on time, but I'll kind of skim through this one. The full scope red team engagement, as I alluded to earlier, we're not given access to a specific thing, and it's not about simulating a specific assumption around a specific process, right? This is where we come, as I say, we go from an unknown outsider to a trusted insider. And this particular engagement was less than a week. It definitely wasn't 280 days. And so here, we started out on LinkedIn, researched all this kind of stuff, figured out who the company was, scraped all the employees' first and last names. We built those, figured out what the username format was. We sprayed all of those things against Outlook Web Access or O365, found some passwords. Also during scanning, we found an RDP gateway. Some of the information in email, we were able to leverage that to connect to that RDP gateway, which gave us inbound access to that organization. There was no MFA involved, so we were immediately inside the environment. We were then able to compromise from that RDP gateway, compromise an end user's laptop that was connected to VPN, which was kind of interesting, right? From that asset, we were able to ultimately come back into the network and compromise an asset management system that IT leveraged to do all of their configuration. It was basically their jump box. ultimately found domain admin credentials and compromised Active Directory, right? And there again, in this particular time, we weren't allowed to go too much further, but we did get into the parent company's VPN and email and connected to their VPN to show that we could. But from that point, we weren't allowed to actually compromise the parent organization. There was a lot of politics that were involved in that one, but we absolutely had the ability to do. We opened the door and we stood in the doorway and we showed them that we had the ability to do so. So anyway, so with that's all the red team stories that I've got. One last thing that I'll kind of pull up is that I've talked about a bunch of stuff. I realized that was a bunch of information, but the gist is that Trustwave is an organization that can handle any one of the security needs that you see on the screen. You know, we have that single pane of glass that allows you to reduce stress and to reduce the overall effort that you need to really secure your organization. And like Matt talked about earlier, we have experts in every discipline and have you know, tons of experience and all that good stuff, right? So with that, I'll open it up for questions and answers. And if anybody has any questions, comments, or thoughts, I would love to hear them.
Yeah, lots of questions. So wasn't perfect timing to weave them in throughout your presentation. So we'll get going. I actually have a good one, or maybe you can elaborate on it. I think I alluded to it at the beginning. What happens is everybody buys these big, you know, firewalls and Palo Altos, and they hire their guy on staff, but they can't keep them employed because they move on, their resume build, and they have to continually hire new people to manage these things. So maybe walk through a couple stories on that of like what happens when they buy these big expensive products, but they don't have the people to manage it in the appropriate resources, and how you guys can help there.
Yeah, there's a couple things, right? So historically, people have bought blinky lights and it makes them feel better. They check the box, and whether they have configured them or not, or a lot of times you'll find them in their default configurations. They feel like, oh, well, I bought it, I'm secure, right? It does what it's supposed to do. I bought it, I deployed the agent, and now I'm secure, right? Most vendors, when they deliver products, they deliver them with the least amount of stuff turned on because they just want them to be usable out of the box. They don't want those things to break your environment, because if you download something or you buy something and it breaks your environment, you're not going to want to use it, right? And so they've lost a customer. And so those devices are configured in such a way that they have the least amount of stuff turned on, and to a point that the vendor is confident that it's not going to break anything, right? So that's the first thing that is pretty common. The second thing is absolutely in the IT industry, especially in the security industry, you know, most guys are job hoppers, right? If you look at resumes, they usually stay a year to year and a half to 2 years sometimes, right? In the industry, we consider somebody who's been with an organization for 3 years, you know, a long timer. And so if you have depended, excuse me, on a single person to be that lead, you know, when they leave, there's going to be a lot of tribal knowledge that leaves with them, right? And so you're going to have to start all over in that process of managing and configuring, you know, those platforms. And so, you know, leveraging an organization to do that is going to help you stay consistent from that perspective. And so one of the things that Trustwave does do is that we have, not only are we really, really good at documentation, so that, you know, once we help you configure, you know, kind of help you architect things and help you configure it, and you know, we'll even help you train that stuff, but we also document those processes really well, and we make sure that we transfer the knowledge that we have back to your organization, so that if you do go somewhere else or you do hire other people, you can bring them up to speed really, really quickly from that perspective.
Cool. Yeah, I love it. So net outsource it to you guys to manage.
That's it.
Yeah, I mean, you guys got the smart people. You got hundreds of these guys in the SpiderLabs figuring it out, proactive on it. You'll make these Palo Altos and other boxes sing like the customer can't on their own.
That's true.
Yeah,
that's true. And as I alluded to earlier, there's a huge shortage on not only are you know, InfoSec guys job hoppers, and that's probably because there's a shortage of us. You know what I mean? And the grass is always greener, so it's just going to be a current, you know, a continuous flux.
It's if you want a job, get into IT. If you want a career, get into security. One of those.
That's it.
This is a pretty easy one. I might even try to answer it myself. Does a company have to be a large enterprise to use Trustwave? And so I'm going to answer that and say no. I mean, we've actually done a bunch of engagements with Trustwave already on the vulnerability testing, the pen testing, and they can range from 5 to 10 to 30 and 40, depending on what you're trying to do. And John has even said, hey, I've seen some of these red teams, these large organizations, get up to like 500,000-600,000. So they'll do anything for everybody. There's nobody too small to get and take advantage of these guys. And so they have the economies to scale where, as a small organization, you get to tap into these large, companies, generally are doing business with large companies and sophisticated people such as Trustwave. You get access to them as your small company.
Yep.
I have security endpoint devices and some other stuff, but I'm shorthanded for qualified staff. How does Trustwave help in these situations? Well, I think we kind of answered that, but you want to answer that a little bit more?
Yeah, so there's a couple ways, right? I mean, we can always staff aug if that's something specifically that person is looking for. Another thing is we can take that headache off of your hands and manage. If you want to co-manage, we can co-manage. If you want us to completely manage, we can completely manage, right? So it's something that if you don't want to deal with it and you need it and you just want to get rid of it, that's something that we can definitely do. If it's something you want to have a little bit more control over, we can definitely do staff augmentation type stuff where we put people in place to help you with those things. You know what I mean? Whether that's from a 9 to 5 perspective, or that's on a monthly perspective, or whatever that means, right? We have those consultants that have that expertise that can help you with that process. And it could just be simply that you need to optimize the devices that you have so that you quit drowning in alerts, right? It's very common, especially with security devices. If you turn everything on, that you start drowning all of these alerts and you don't know which one is the one you need to pay attention to. And sometimes simply tuning those devices and turning off the things that you're not interested in so that you can only pay attention to the things that truly matter is another way that we can of course help you.
Great, love that, great answer. Ransomware really scares me. What should a company do to avoid this or deal with it when it happens?
Well, I guess the only way you can deal with it is to turn off your computers. It's a real deal. I mean, it's here, and ransomware happens in multiple different flavors, right? I was totally kidding, by the way. If you
or the other way to deal with it is just have some Bitcoin on your balance sheet.
That's it, right? and hope they actually turn it off when you pay them. Hopefully they have some. I've actually seen some that have customer service attached to them, which I thought was bizarre, but I guess it makes sense, right? It's total business model. And from an attacker's perspective, if you don't give people what they paid for, they're probably not going to pay you next time. So if you want that revolving revenue, then you should definitely keep that in mind. But so ransomware comes in a couple of different flavors, right? You've got the very basic stuff that will encrypt at a user level. It's not doing kind of privilege escalation, and it's only going to try to encrypt things that are on the local PC that user has ability to access, or things on a network share that they have the ability to access. That in itself, can be damaging, but backups are usually pretty simple to handle those types of things. And whether it's your volume shadow copies for individual files, or you're backing up the files on the disk to something like OneDrive, whatever, right? I mean, those are usually fairly simple to recover from. Now, if your users are running as local admin and that box has a shared local administrator password with lots of other boxes, now all of a sudden that very generic ransomware can become a big deal, especially if it has the capabilities of extracting passwords from SAM or from memory and then leveraging those across the wire, which some of the ones that we saw, that are kind of in the caliber of NotPetya had the ability to do, right? And if you're talking about that types of stuff, those can become a nightmare very, very quickly. One of the things that we're seeing a rise of is ransomware that is not sent by a phishing email or those types of things, but it's actually leveled by an adversary, meaning that somebody has already compromised your organization, and then they're going to let loose ransomware for some means, right? Now, whether that's through them actually breaching your organization, or that's them breaching a secondary organization that you either get updates from or that you're connected to, and we have lots of examples of that. If you read books or the news or whatnot, right, you can kind of get where I'm going with that. Those at that level, honestly, ransomware is not the thing that you should focus on. Ransomware is the outcome of a lot of bad security assumptions that have led to that point, right? So basically what that means is that used to, bad guys would just deface stuff. And then, it upgraded to bad guys would steal data and they would exfiltrate data and they would sell that data. Now it's turned to, I'm going to use the ransomware to kind of bludgeon you across the head to pay me for this. And then I'm also going to use that to steal data as well, right? And so that's basically what ransomware is. I wouldn't necessarily focus about it, even though it is super scary. I would focus on how did the ransomware get there, right? And a lot of the stuff you're saying, especially the stuff that's super devastating right now, that ransomware was sent or was executed from an adversary who already had access to your environment from that perspective.
I mean, isn't the number one thing to take really good backups so you guys can basically start over if you do get hit with malware?
100%.
You can pay the money or just to restore from a backup and wipe it out.
Yeah, I wouldn't ever pay the money. It's because they're criminals. Who says they're actually going to give you anything? They may. I mean, there are organizations that pay, and when they're hurt, I mean, you're going to try everything you can. But the most crucial thing in IT is backups. That it's been that way from the beginning, and it will always be that way. Whether the catastrophic failure is physical, is from Mother Nature, is man-made, it doesn't matter. If you don't have good backups, you're gonna be in a bad situation at some point in time.
Here's a good one that's close to PacketFusion as well. We have access to 500-600 of our customers' databases for phone systems. We have access to their network, and we're getting hit with a lot of these security audits and these security reviews, and these compliance standards, and it's a big undertaking for us. And I'm wondering what you guys do. This is coming from one of our customers as well. What do you guys do to help with compliance and security audits and those kind of things?
We've got a huge business unit called Secure Trust that has all of those compliance professionals that can answer all of those questions and handle that from A to Z, from not being compliant all the way to the point of being compliant. And part of that, the SpiderLabs brand fits into from a protection perspective, from a detection perspective, if those types of things are needed. But more specifically, any of the testing stuff, which is very common from a compliance standpoint, to do regular vulnerability scans, to do penetration testing activities, to remediate those and kind of go through that cycle of making sure that those things are tested and remediated. Like I said, we're an A to Z shop for all of those needs.
Great, awesome. A couple more. All comes around. These next couple questions are all like threat hunting. Can it be automated? And how often should we be doing threat hunting?
So, of course, like anything, pieces of it can be automated, right? The collection of data can be automated, but the analysis, you hear a lot of buzz terms, AI and all this kind of stuff. And I think that technology is getting better, but it doesn't take the place for an actual seasoned operator who's looking at the data that comes back, right? So a lot of it can be automated. And I would say, security is always about layers, about ratcheting up that bar. And it would be better to have an automated threat hunt solution that is better than not having anything at all, for sure, right? And there's tons of platforms. There's even open source stuff that allows you to do that on a regular basis, right? But there again, that kind of goes back to a lot of historical stuff about actually having access to those devices. There are new things like EDRs and OS query type devices that have agents on boxes that will allow you to do threat hunting type activities or queries of specific boxes. So, but there again, part of it can be automated, but I wouldn't say that a lot of it can be automated. And it kind of goes the same thing with pen testing, right? A lot of stuff can be automated in pen testing, but the real value of pen testing is actually by a human person looking at stuff and validating those assumptions that they see in front of them, right? And threat hunting is the same way.
John, I don't know if I'm going to sleep better or worse tonight. You got me scared to the point, like, I'm hoping, half of security is like scaring people to go do stuff. And it's all an insurance policy, right? All this is insurance policy, because, once it hits, it hits you hard and you're like, gosh, why did I have that insurance? Why did I pay it? Right. So, top of the hour, you kick butt for us. Thanks so much. I had a lot of fun. I think the takeaway, guys, are, if through this whole thing, only one person dropped. We have 100+ people on the call all day, so only one person dropped, which was awesome. So great content. The takeaway is, if any of this is interesting to you, reach out to me. Matt Pingatore, mpingatore at packetfusion.com, sales@packetfusion.com. And we can start anything from a simple several $1,000 network vulnerability test all the way up to, you know, taking over your firewalls and managing your firewalls so you can get further up the matrix, the maturity matrix, and be proactive on all this stuff.
Thanks everybody for
all right. Thanks
spending
guys.
some time with us.
Awesome. Recordings coming. Thanks guys. Talk to you next week at our next one.